Imagine walking into a forgotten farmhouse, floorboards creaking under your boots. The air smells of dust and rot, but what you find hidden beneath those planks freezes you in place. Not gold, not weapons, but photographs, dozens of them, spanning generations. And in every single frame, the faces stare back with the same hollow emptiness. Eyes like glass, expressions carved in stone, children, fathers, entire bloodlines, all stripped of emotion. It's as if humanity itself had been drained out of them. What could twist a family so completely, so relentlessly that even their smiles vanished over centuries? To uncover that, we have to go back, far back, to a man who thought he was protecting his family, when in reality he was cursing them forever. If stories like this make you lean in closer instead of looking away, you're exactly who we make these documentaries for. So if you want more hidden histories, forgotten families, and the kind of stories others are too afraid to tell, make sure you subscribe right now. Drop a comment with where you're watching from. It helps YouTube know you're part of this journey. And trust me, you don't want to miss what comes next. The wind cut across the Kentucky hills in the late 18th century, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and pine. Into this wilderness rode Ezekiel Holloway, a man convinced destiny had chosen him. He was broad-shouldered, sunburned, and stubborn in a way that made most men wary. To him, the forested valley was not a hardship but a fortress. Here, he would rule his bloodline. Ezekiel believed his family had been touched by divine fire. He claimed his blood was sacred, set apart from ordinary men. In these woods, far from prying eyes, that belief would become law. His sons followed behind him, weary from weeks of travel. They were young, restless, and yet bound by his word. Whatever dreams they once carried had to bend beneath Ezekiel's command. When he drove the first stake into the soil, Ezekiel felt he had planted more than a home. He believed he was planting eternity itself, an empire of men unsullied by outsiders. The valley was treacherous, carved by rivers that twisted like scars through the land. But Ezekiel saw beauty where others saw hardship. He saw walls raised not by stone, but by nature itself. Isolation was not a burden to him. It was protection. He taught his sons that distance from other men was purity, that every mile separating them from society was a shield against corruption. In those early days, neighbors were unheard of. The nearest settlement was days away. Ezekiel's word was absolute. His sons knew no counsel but his, no authority but the heavy weight of his scripture. Every evening, he gathered his boys around a fire that smoked and spat sparks into the night. He read aloud, twisting words of scripture into warnings against mingling with the world outside. "Your blood is not to be diluted," he told them, his voice hard as oak. "It is sacred, chosen. Break that chain, and you defy the very will of God himself." The boys absorbed these sermons with wide eyes. Some doubted in silence, but none dared speak against him. His authority was not to be challenged. He was prophet, leader, father, and judge. Years passed, and the Holloway homestead grew. Cabins rose from timber, fields were cleared for corn and tobacco, and still, no outsiders set foot in their valley. Ezekiel made certain of it. When his sons came of age, a problem arose. The closest communities lay beyond ridges and ravines. Travel was dangerous, and Ezekiel despised the idea of blood mixing with strangers. His solution was chilling. He ordered his sons to take wives only within the family line. At first, it was cousins. Later, it would be closer bonds. Ezekiel did not see ruin. He saw obedience to God. To the boys, resistance meant damnation. Fear burned hotter than desire, and so they obeyed. They married as he commanded, believing themselves chosen, believing disobedience would bring divine punishment. The pattern began. The first generation born of this decree appeared normal enough. healthy, strong, able to till fields and hunt game. Their silence, however, was striking. They laughed less, spoke less, and rarely sought joy. Ezekiel celebrated this quiet demeanor as spiritual proof. "The world is noisy," he preached, "but we are still. We do not need the clamor of fools to confirm our strength." The children of these unions rarely ventured beyond the valley. They grew up chasing shadows in the woods, listening to Ezekiel's sermons, and repeating his words until they became truths engraved in their bones. By the time Ezekiel grew gray-bearded, the Holloway homestead had turned into a fortress of silence. Outsiders who passed through the valley spoke of strange men who barely acknowledged their presence. Some travelers described the Holloways as statues more than people, with still eyes and rigid manners. Others simply avoided them altogether, sensing a wrongness that lingered in every gesture, every quiet stare. Ezekiel ignored such whispers. He told his sons these were signs of envy. "Other men fear what they cannot match," he said. "They mock what they cannot join. We are untouchable." When his sons bore children, Ezekiel's conviction deepened. He held those infants with pride, seeing them not as individuals but as vessels carrying his sacred blood. He rejoiced at their blank stares and calm silence. The valley's seasons marked time, but nothing changed in the Holloway rule. Winter snow pressed against their cabins. Summer heat baked the fields. Through it all, Ezekiel's commandment was unshaken, enforced by fear and faith. He told tales of outsiders falling to ruin, of cities filled with corruption, men who betrayed one another, families torn apart. Against this backdrop of imagined horror, his valley looked like paradise. By 1820, the Holloway sons themselves had children reaching maturity. And again, the same problem arose. No outsiders were allowed. This time, marriages tightened further, closing the circle of blood more dangerously. The boys obeyed because obedience was life itself. To rebel against Ezekiel's command was to rebel against God. And so cousin took cousin, and uncle claimed niece, until the tree bent inward. From the outside, the homestead still looked ordinary. Smoke from chimneys, men laboring in fields, tools ringing against stone. But inside those cabins, the foundation of a curse had already taken root. Generations of whispered obedience had silenced curiosity. The Holloway sons no longer questioned why. They believed isolation was destiny, that mixing blood was sin, that blank stares were blessings rather than warnings. Ezekiel walked among them with pride, beard white, back still straight, a patriarch convinced of victory. He never once suspected he had planted poison that would choke his descendants for centuries. The early children, born from cousin unions, showed no obvious deformities. Their limbs were strong, their eyes clear. Yet there was something missing, a flicker of humanity absent from their gaze. Neighbors, rare as they were, noted it. Hunters passing through remarked on children who never smiled, who watched silently from trees, who showed no fear of strangers, only cold, unwavering observation. Ezekiel dismissed such talk as slander. To him, stillness was strength. Detachment was holiness. He boasted that his children had been spared the petty emotions that weakened ordinary men. But the truth was darker. What appeared holy to Ezekiel was the first quiet symptom of genetic ruin. He did not know it, but the bloodline had begun its irreversible collapse. Still, the family thrived outwardly. Crops grew, cabins stood firm, and new Holloways were born with each passing year. Ezekiel called this proof of divine favor, never recognizing the warning beneath it. By the 1830s, he was an old man. His sons carried his legacy forward with zeal. They repeated his sermons word for word, embedding his commandments deeper into the family's marrow. Ezekiel's final years were marked by pride. He believed he had secured purity forever. Surrounded by sons and grandsons, he died certain his vision had triumphed. But the curse was only beginning. When he was buried in the valley's soil, the ground closed over more than his body. It sealed a commandment into the earth, a commandment that would strangle 11 generations of Holloways. From that moment onward, no Holloway questioned the decree. It became tradition, doctrine, destiny. And with every marriage, every birth, every blank stare, the bloodline inched closer to the abyss. The forest watched silently as decades passed. What began as obedience to one man's twisted conviction was slowly transforming into something monstrous. The land itself seemed to hold its breath. For Ezekiel's bloodline was not fading. It was changing. Each child born into Devil's Hollow carried within him not blessing but curse, not purity but decay. The beginning of the end was written. The Holloway story had only taken root, and though Ezekiel believed he had created strength, he had forged fragility masquerading as faith. The silence in their eyes was the first warning of many. The decades following Ezekiel's death did not loosen the grip of his commandment. Instead, it grew stronger, woven into every prayer, every tradition, every whispered warning passed from fathers to sons inside the Holloway Valley. The Holloway men now spoke of their ancestor with reverence bordering on worship. They called him prophet, chosen, guardian of sacred blood. His grave was visited not with mourning, but with oaths of continued obedience. As generations folded inward, the family tree became less like a branching oak and more like a tightening noose. Cousin wed cousin, nephew joined uncle's line, and the pattern circled endlessly. The early signs of deterioration emerged subtly. Children born in the second generation seemed slower to speak, slower to laugh. Their eyes lingered longer on nothing, their expressions stiffened, their voices grew flat and monotone. The Holloway men mistook this quietness for divine proof of purity. They praised their sons for calmness, saying outsiders were noisy, corrupted by frivolity. Inside Devil's Hollow, stillness was celebrated as strength, detachment as sacred. By the 1840s, the family had developed its own dialect. Words slurred together, tones flattened, cadence stripped of inflection. Outsiders who occasionally heard this speech claimed it sounded more like chanting than conversation. Still, no outsider dared confront them. The Holloway men remained isolated, their homestead hidden behind ridges and forests. To passers-by, they were rumors more than neighbors, shadows glimpsed and then avoided without explanation. But within the Holloway cabins, the shadows deepened. The second generation raised sons who did not weep when hurt, who did not play as ordinary boys, who seemed detached even from their father's pride. By the 1860s, the third generation was born, and with them came more obvious signs. Their faces looked slightly compressed, as though shaped by unseen hands pressing inward. Their eyes carried distant, vacant qualities. Travelers who encountered them in nearby settlements described eerie stillness. Shopkeepers reported young Holloways staring at objects for long stretches, not speaking, not reacting, as though suspended between thought and emptiness. When confronted, they responded with voices drained of emotion, always in the same monotone. Even bargaining for goods felt unnatural, their words recited like memorized lines rather than genuine conversation. The community grew uneasy. Children whispered of Holloways moving like sleepwalkers. Fathers muttered about bad omens. Still, no one dared interfere, for the Holloways carried themselves with a confidence that disarmed suspicion. Inside Devil's Hollow, however, confidence masked decline. The boys were slower, weaker in reflex, yet their fathers insisted this was evidence of spiritual tranquility. The bloodline was praised even as it decayed. A family doctor who once visited recorded troubling notes in his private journal. He observed children who did not seek comfort, who showed no startle at pain, who stared blankly through days and nights. His observations never reached wider audiences. The Holloways dismissed him as an outsider who could not understand. They saw their sons as gifts, living proof of chosen blood, ignoring the silent warning of emptiness. As decades turned, the deterioration worsened. Fourth-generation boys bore elongated skulls, disproportionate limbs, and expressions that never shifted. Their faces seemed carved in neutrality, incapable of smile or frown, forever frozen in blank repose. Yet the men of the valley carried themselves proudly, parading their sons as though they were trophies. They mistook the lifeless stares as evidence of deeper wisdom, spiritual calm beyond ordinary comprehension. Locals recoiled. Farmers in nearby towns told stories of Holloway boys who stood in silence, staring for minutes without blinking. Some swore their presence drained warmth from the room itself. Despite this, the Holloways continued their rituals. They gathered for solemn meals where silence reigned supreme. They prayed together, their voices blending into a monotone hymn that sounded more mechanical than heartfelt. The Holloway boys were taught from birth that their blood was sacred. They learned early that outsiders were corrupt, dangerous, and unworthy. Any sign of emotion was scorned as weakness. By the turn of the century, fifth-generation Holloways entered the world. Doctors who encountered them recorded horrors unknown in medical literature. Muscles of the face seemed incapable of expression, locked into lifeless neutrality. One account described a boy stepping on a nail that pierced through his foot. He neither cried nor flinched, only looked downward as though observing something insignificant, eyes empty of recognition or pain. These children unsettled anyone who saw them. They resembled mannequins, perfectly formed yet lacking spark. Their faces carried symmetry without humanity, smoothness without warmth, a chilling perfection that felt closer to death than life. The Holloway fathers, however, remained convinced of divine purpose. They believed stillness equaled purity, detachment meant chosen status. In their eyes, their sons were closer to angels than ordinary men. Neighbors avoided them more openly now. Some towns quietly discouraged Holloways from entering shops or markets. The men's presence left others unsettled, a discomfort they could not name but instinctively fled. Even when shunned, the Holloways retreated deeper into their mythology. They claimed outsiders envied them, feared their strength, resented their sacred inheritance. Isolation became both a prison and a crown they wore proudly. By the 1920s, sixth and seventh generations emerged, shaped by tighter loops of blood. Their minds seemed dulled, their movements mechanical, their capacity for thought reduced to mimicry and repetition. One traveling merchant recounted eating supper with them. He described an entire table of Holloways chewing in synchronized silence, pausing when he spoke, then resuming together without acknowledgement, like puppets bound to invisible strings. Such testimonies spread fear across neighboring towns. Children whispered ghost stories of Holloways who stood together in fields at dusk, unmoving, eyes fixed on nothing, waiting for purposes no one dared imagine. The Holloway men insisted these were lies. To them, outsiders were blind to truth. They told their sons their emotionless state was purity, that their mechanical unity was divine harmony. Inside Devil's Hollow, rituals solidified. Boys repeated tasks endlessly, splitting wood, milking cattle, carrying water, never with joy or complaint, only with vacant precision, as though driven by instincts rather than independent thought. Generations of fathers taught obedience as destiny. Curiosity was stamped out, questions silenced, individuality erased. The Holloway way was sameness, stillness, blankness, carried forward like scripture etched into the bones. Each new child born seemed further removed from humanity. Their stillness grew heavier, their voices flatter, their eyes more lifeless. Yet the men around them only clapped shoulders in pride, blind to decay. As the decades turned, the valley itself seemed cursed. Travelers spoke of unnatural silence within its borders, as though even birds avoided singing there, as though the land carried the Holloway affliction. The curse deepened with every union, every birth, every lifeless stare. By the time the seventh generation stood tall, the Holloways were less like men and more like shadows wearing human forms. Still, they believed themselves chosen. Still, they repeated Ezekiel's words with fervor. Still, they saw their decay as purity, convinced they were closer to God than the laughing, crying men outside their valley. But in truth, they were descending into something darker. Generations in the shadows had carved away humanity piece by piece, leaving behind not saints, not angels, but husks with hollow eyes. The outside world was changing, railroads, factories, cities growing. Yet inside Devil's Hollow, time stood still. And with every stagnant year, the Holloway bloodline slid closer to extinction, disguised as holiness. The shadows deepened, and though the Holloways clung to their delusions, the world beyond their valley was beginning to notice. Their secret would not remain buried forever. Their shadows would soon meet light. By the early 20th century, the Holloway photographs began to tell a story words could never capture. Fathers lined their sons before crude cameras, and generation after generation stared forward with expressions carved in stone. In the first images, the faces still carried faint traces of humanity, jawlines stern, eyes alert, lips tightened. Yet as decades passed, the portraits transformed into galleries of emptiness, blank canvases masquerading as men. Neighbors who glimpsed these photographs spoke of unease they could not explain. It wasn't deformity alone that unsettled them, but the lifeless stares that suggested an absence far deeper than flesh or bone. Each image recorded progression. First came stillness, then detachment, then a terrifying neutrality, until the faces looked sculpted rather than living, as though every trace of expression had been smoothed away by invisible hands. The Holloway men displayed these portraits proudly, believing them proof of divine purity. They saw no horror in the vacant eyes, no tragedy in the frozen lips. To them, blankness was holiness. Travelers who stumbled across these images recoiled. Some refused to sleep afterward, claiming the hollow stares followed them through dreams, unblinking, expressionless, empty of anything resembling the spark that marks a human soul. The third and fourth generations had already carried hints of this transformation, but by the fifth, the change was undeniable. Children grew with faces that seemed incapable of conveying laughter, anger, or grief. Doctors who examined them noted muscular failures across the face. Smiles could not form, brows could not furrow, tears never fell. Pain, when inflicted, registered only as silence and stillness, nothing more. One physician recalled pricking a boy's palm with a needle. The boy simply looked down at the puncture, blood rising slowly, yet his face never shifted, eyes blank, mouth motionless. To the doctor, this was evidence of catastrophic genetic decline. To the Holloway fathers, it was evidence of strength. They declared their sons unshaken, untouched by trivial suffering that plagued ordinary men. The contradiction defined their lineage. What the outside world saw as ruin, the Holloways celebrated as victory. Their curse disguised as blessing, their downfall dressed as triumph, their hollow faces mistaken for crowns. Locals in nearby towns began whispering of them like specters. Children were told not to look a Holloway in the eyes, lest that blank stare drain warmth from the living. Some tales claimed Holloways moved through towns in eerie silence, buying goods with monotone words, never blinking, never smiling. Shopkeepers described unease so deep it made the air feel colder. The Holloways themselves ignored such whispers. Their mythology was stronger than rumor. They saw themselves not as men cursed, but as men refined, stripped of worldly clutter, purified into calm vessels of chosen blood. Inside their cabins, portraits lined the walls like icons. Fathers pointed to images of expressionless ancestors and told sons, "This is strength. This is proof we are not like other men." But the truth was unavoidable. Each new generation bore faces less capable of expression than the last. Each boy looked more mannequin than human. features molded into symmetrical lifelessness. By the seventh generation, photographs showed groups of Holloway children standing shoulder to shoulder, each identical in posture, gaze, and emptiness. The effect was chilling, like staring into rows of sculpted wax figures. Travelers who saw these groups in person spoke of unnatural synchronization. When one child tilted his head, others soon mirrored. When one blinked, the rest seemed to follow, creating eerie waves of mimicry. Folklore spread quickly. Some claimed the Holloways were no longer truly men, but husks animated by something else, vessels emptied of soul. Whether truth or superstition, the legend of hollow faces grew. The Holloway fathers doubled down, teaching sons that sameness was unity, blankness was purity, silence was strength. They turned deformity into doctrine, convincing themselves they had transcended rather than decayed. Meanwhile, the photographs piled higher, documenting a lineage collapsing in slow motion. Each image was a time capsule of ruin, a silent record of how conviction turned blood into dust. Doctors who later discovered these photographs described them as among the most disturbing historical artifacts ever preserved. Each face represented not only genetic damage, but willful blindness passed from father to son. Observers noted how fathers stood proudly behind sons, expressions equally void, gazes equally detached, proud of what they had wrought, oblivious to the tragedy their lineage had become. It wasn't only appearance that haunted outsiders, it was behavior. Boys sat still for hours, unmoving, eyes unfocused. Teachers who briefly worked with them described lessons as futile, like speaking to carved stone. When asked questions, the boys responded with monotone answers, eyes fixed on nothing, words stripped of emotion. Their presence drained the room of life, leaving silence heavier than any lecture. The Holloways insisted this was enlightenment. They claimed their children had reached a higher state of being, free from earthly concerns, beyond laughter or sorrow, living as spiritual vessels of divine will. Yet the photographs betrayed the truth. For every proud father, there was a lifeless son, his gaze hollow, his face immobile. Generations aligned like a mirror reflecting emptiness deeper each time. The portraits showed not triumph but entropy, lineage spiraling into vacancy, expression dissolving into nothingness, a family mistaking collapse for glory, while the world beyond saw only evidence of human fragility stretched too far. Local folklore darkened further. Some swore the Holloway faces could be glimpsed at night, staring from tree lines, pale and blank. Others claimed their eyes glowed faintly, reflections of something inhuman dwelling within. These stories spread fear, but they also cemented isolation. Outsiders avoided Devil's Hollow altogether, leaving the Holloways to continue their silent rituals, breeding their own myth deeper into the valley's soil. Every new photograph that emerged became another link in a chain of dread. What began with Ezekiel's stern pride ended as portraits of wax-like figures, mouths sealed, eyes lifeless, humanity eroded away. The hollow faces became symbols of the curse, not just evidence of genetic ruin, but proof of how conviction blinded generations of men into worshiping their own downfall as holy. And still, they posed for the camera. Still, they lined up proudly. Fathers behind sons, expressions fixed in eternal blankness, believing they were recording proof of chosen greatness rather than documenting descent into silence. The photographs endure to this day, relics of tragedy preserved in fading sepia. They tell the story Ezekiel never imagined, that his commandment had forged not saints, but statues with blood still pumping. Each frame captures the horror of belief hardened into doctrine. Each lifeless face is a monument to how far men can fall when blinded by faith in their own supposed purity. By the time outsiders pieced the story together, the Holloways were no longer men of mystery, but men of myth. Their hollow faces had become warnings whispered across Kentucky hillsides for generations. The portraits alone might have been enough to chill the blood, but the truth was worse. For behind those blank stares were boys and men trapped in shells stripped of humanity. The Holloway curse was no longer rumor, no longer invisible. It was visible in every photograph, carved into every face, echoing through every blank stare. The hollow faces had become the family's legacy. The Holloway story might have remained confined to photographs and whispers, but over time, outsiders encountered them in ways too disturbing to forget. These accounts spread like wildfire, fueling legends of men stripped of humanity. The earliest descriptions came from hunters who stumbled into Devil's Hollow by accident. They spoke of boys who appeared suddenly in the trees, staring silently, never blinking, vanishing as quietly as they appeared. One hunter described the encounter as more terrifying than facing a bear. "At least animals move with instinct," he explained. "These boys stood too still, too quiet, like carved wood that breathed." Shopkeepers told stories of Holloway men visiting town, walking stiffly into stores, examining items with expressionless faces, and speaking in monotone. Negotiations felt mechanical, as if words were repeated rather than meant. Local fathers often told their sons not to linger near them. Something about their stillness was contagious, leaving ordinary men unsettled, drained of warmth, as though life itself recoiled from such presence. A blacksmith recounted one evening when two Holloways entered his shop. They stood motionless for nearly 10 minutes, eyes fixed on the same tool, never speaking, before turning and walking away in silence. Teachers, though rare in these remote regions, also left haunting impressions. One man who attempted to educate Holloway children described it as teaching statues. They sat rigid, spoke flatly, and never displayed curiosity. He recalled asking questions about basic arithmetic, only to receive responses delivered in unison, words devoid of tone. He left the valley convinced the boys were incapable of independent thought or genuine learning. Another traveler, a salesman, wrote of his supper with the Holloways in the 1920s. He claimed the family ate silently, every movement synchronized, pausing when he spoke, resuming afterward without acknowledgement. The salesman described it as dining with automatons. "It was like watching machines chew," he confessed. Each motion rehearsed, each expression non-existent, their stares pressing against me like invisible hands. Doctors who visited the Holloways provided the most chilling reports. One noted that children failed to respond to sudden noises, failed to blink when objects approached, and seemed incapable of registering surprise. He documented a boy pricked with a needle who only watched blood gather without flinching. Another child stood barefoot on cold stone for hours, unshaken, as though sensation itself no longer reached him. The physician's notes, preserved secretly, suggested genetic catastrophe unfolding in plain sight. Yet the Holloways refused intervention. To them, these traits were proof of their sacred uniqueness, not signs of irreversible decline. Neighbors in nearby towns described being followed by Holloway boys. They moved silently along dirt roads, keeping distance, never speaking, only staring. Some men admitted the stares haunted them for years afterward. Folklore grew from these encounters. Tales spread of Holloways gathering at twilight, standing in fields without speaking, moving in eerie unison. Boys swore they saw entire groups tilting heads at the same moment. A logger once told of meeting 3 Holloway men at a crossroads. He greeted them, but none answered. They simply stared, then turned simultaneously and walked into the woods without a word. Such stories blurred the line between truth and legend, but they all shared the same detail, the absence of expression. No anger, no joy, no fear, only blankness that defied understanding. Encounters grew increasingly unsettling as generations passed. Reports surfaced of Holloway boys repeating tasks endlessly, stacking wood, carrying buckets, or pacing circles as though trapped in mechanical rituals without sense or purpose. Visitors described this behavior as more frightening than deformity. It suggested not only physical decline, but the loss of inner life itself, as though these men were present in body yet absent in spirit. Even among themselves, Holloway interactions were unnerving. Witnesses noted how they rarely conversed. When they did, voices carried identical tones, words clipped and rehearsed, like echoes bouncing between hollow walls. The most detailed testimony came from a traveling preacher who spent a night at their homestead. He wrote of silence so thick it felt oppressive, broken only by synchronized chewing at supper. When he spoke of Scripture, the men listened without reaction, their eyes fixed on him with intensity, devoid of passion. He left before dawn, shaken, certain he had dined with the soulless. These encounters cemented the Holloways as legends of horror. Outsiders whispered of them around campfires, warning sons never to wander near Devil's Hollow lest they meet faces drained of humanity. Yet within their valley, the Holloways thrived in self-delusion. They interpreted every disturbing account as proof of chosen destiny. They claimed outsiders feared them because purity intimidates corruption. Even when doctors declared their condition catastrophic, Holloway men dismissed the words. They believed science could not measure their sacred state. Blankness, to them, was not disease, but elevation. Each encounter added to their myth, each story feeding isolation. Outsiders grew too frightened to approach, leaving the Holloways further buried in their rituals, unchallenged in belief, deeper in decline. But those who met them never forgot. Their accounts were written in diaries, letters, and journals, preserved as evidence of one of the most disturbing families ever to walk American soil. The consistency across testimonies made disbelief impossible. Hunters, shopkeepers, doctors, preachers, travelers, all described the same faces, the same silence, the same haunting stillness that stripped the Holloways of all humanity. The myth of the Holloways grew so large that even nearby towns felt cursed. Men avoided mentioning their name after dark, as though speaking it aloud would summon blank eyes. The Holloway men became specters in their own lifetimes, seen less as neighbors and more as apparitions haunting the edges of civilization, embodiments of something gone terribly wrong in human nature. Yet for all the horror, the Holloways themselves remained oblivious. Encounters with outsiders confirmed their myths. Each stare, each silence, each blank face was framed not as a flaw but as triumph. The tragedy deepened because they could not see themselves. They believed their cursed traits were blessings, their hollow faces proof of destiny. Every encounter only hardened the walls of their delusion, so the valley remained silent, the photographs multiplied, and the encounters continued to feed legends. Each story echoed the same chilling truth. The Holloways were men who had lost the spark of manhood. The outside world was changing rapidly, but Devil's Hollow stayed frozen in time. Every visitor left shaken, every witness carried scars, and still the Holloways stood unmoving, unblinking, believing themselves divine. The encounters revealed not just physical decay, but psychological blindness. A family too far gone to recognize ruin, too steeped in myth to acknowledge decline, too lost in shadows to seek light. And yet, as haunting as these encounters were, they were only the beginning. The outside world was stirring. The Holloway secret could not remain confined forever. Exposure was inevitable. Soon the Holloways would face scrutiny they could not avoid. And when authorities finally arrived in Devil's Hollow, what they discovered would eclipse every rumor, every photograph, every haunting encounter before. By the 1930s, whispers about the Holloways had grown too loud for the outside world to ignore. Hunters, merchants, and local fathers spoke of faces drained of life, boys who moved like shadows in human form. The state began receiving reports too consistent to dismiss. Letters described children who never flinched, Men who spoke in mechanical tones, families who lived in isolation with a mythology that twisted silence into holiness. Authorities grew concerned not only about folklore, but about public health. If the stories were true, the Holloways represented a living experiment in genetic collapse, a tragedy hidden behind ridges and superstition. A young inspector named James Morrison was assigned to the region. Determined and fearless, he vowed to uncover the truth. Carrying notebooks and medical instruments, he rode deep into Devil's Hollow alone. What he found shook him. The 8th generation of Holloway boys stood before him, their skulls misshapen, limbs disproportionate, and faces incapable of expression. Their eyes did not blink, even when startled. Morrison tried simple tests. He waved his hand suddenly before their faces. No reaction. He clapped loudly behind their heads. No flinch. He touched their arms with cold metal. No shiver. His notes described a catastrophic absence of natural reflexes. He wrote of boys who seemed detached from sensation itself, as if nerves carried signals to bodies but never to minds. Even worse was the silence. When Morrison attempted conversation, responses came flatly, delivered with identical cadence, as though words were memorized rather than thought. Individuality was gone. Expression was gone. Humanity seemed gone. Morrison returned shaken but resolute. He filed a report warning of the most severe case of inherited degeneration in living memory. State officials were alarmed, realizing they could no longer ignore Devil's Hollow. A convoy was assembled. Doctors, social workers, lawmen, and county officers determined to intervene. They rode into the valley with dread, armed with notebooks, rifles, and orders to uncover whatever horror lingered there. Sheriff Thomas Bradley led the team. A seasoned man, he admitted later, nothing in decades of service prepared him for what they found. The Holloway homestead was less a farm than a mausoleum. Cabins leaned under weight of neglect. Smoke barely rose from chimneys. And then the men appeared, tall, pale, stiff, eyes hollow, movements synchronized, as though time itself had sculpted them into mechanical figures. Bradley described the encounter in hushed tones years later. He said it felt like walking into a place where life had been drained, leaving behind only the shells of men who no longer lived. Inside the cabins, conditions were worse. Infants lay in corners, underfed, unmoving. Older boys sat motionless on wooden chairs, eyes tracking nothing, faces slack, bodies upright only by instinct rather than intention. Morrison recorded every detail. He noted severe malnutrition, skeletal deformities, and cognitive absence. But most disturbing was the lack of emotional response, even from infants, who stared blankly instead of crying. The team attempted to speak with adult Holloways. They received sermons in return, monotone declarations that their blood was chosen, their silence holy, their sons purified beyond the reach of ordinary men. When authorities explained they were taking children for care, the men grew defensive. Some brandished rifles, their eyes lifeless yet voices filled with fanatic conviction. They swore outsiders sought to destroy God's work. A standoff began. For 3 days, the Holloway men refused surrender. They barricaded cabins, posted guards, and spoke of curses falling upon anyone daring to separate sons from fathers. Tension hung heavy as gunpowder. Bradley later admitted he feared massacre. The Holloway men carried weapons, but stood unnervingly calm, as though ready to die without hesitation. Their blank stares made them unpredictable, more terrifying than open aggression. Finally, state officers advanced. Shots rang out, echoing off ridges. In the chaos, several Holloways resisted fiercely, while others stood frozen, motionless even as bullets struck walls around them. 12 boys were seized and removed from the property. They did not cry or resist. They simply walked when guided, eyes fixed on nothing, steps eerily synchronized, as though bound by invisible command. The captured children unsettled even hardened officers. One deputy confessed he would rather face armed criminals than those boys with hollow eyes, because guns fired bullets, but their stares pierced something deeper. Inside the cabins, authorities discovered conditions bordering on nightmarish. Floors smeared with filth, food scarce, boys huddled silently together, some gnawing wood or fabric without awareness, as though instinct replaced reason. Morrison described it as a scene from which humanity seemed absent. He believed the family had passed beyond rescue, that 11 generations of inbreeding had carved away the essence of manhood itself. The surviving Holloway men were arrested or scattered into the hills, but the legacy of Devil's Hollow could not be erased by force. The boys carried proof of ruin in their faces. Those who witnessed the intervention never forgot. Officers spoke of sleepless nights, haunted by memories of unblinking eyes, synchronized silence, and children who behaved less like humans and more like broken machines. Even Bradley, a hardened sheriff, told his son years later that nothing in war or law prepared him for Holloways. He described them as the most terrifying men he ever faced alive. Rumors spread through Kentucky like wildfire. Towns whispered of the raid, of boys removed under cover of rifles, of a family whose bloodline had finally collapsed into something less than human. Some believed the Holloways were punished by divine wrath. Others claimed science alone explained their fall. But no explanation could ease the unease left by their photographs, their silence, their blank stares. The intervention marked the beginning of the end. The Holloways who remained scattered into wilderness, broken and hunted, while the boys taken away entered institutions where doctors struggled to comprehend their condition. Yet the land itself felt scarred. Devil's Hollow remained avoided, whispered of as cursed ground. Hunters claimed the air still carried unnatural silence, as though echoes of hollow eyes lingered in the soil. For authorities, the case was sealed. Records were hidden, photographs locked away, testimonies buried. They believed silence would protect the public from horror too deep to confront. But silence could not erase truth. The Holloway curse had been exposed, and though the family line was fractured, the legacy endured. Every officer, every doctor, every deputy carried the memory, scars of an encounter with men drained of humanity. The photographs discovered years later confirmed what words struggled to capture. Generations of faces devoid of expression, lined in rows, staring forever, frozen proof of one family's descent into living oblivion. The exposure of the Holloways was both an ending and a beginning. Their secret was broken open, yet the deeper tragedy lay ahead, as institutions struggled to rehabilitate boys too far gone. Devil's Hollow stood empty, yet not free. For decades after, locals swore the valley remained cursed, the silence unnatural, the trees heavy with memories of men whose faces reflected nothing at all. And though the Holloway cabins rotted, their myth endured. The encounter between state and bloodline ensured their story would live, retold in whispers, a warning etched into the hills of Kentucky. The intervention had ended the Holloways' secrecy, but not their shadow. Their legacy was now inescapable, carried in reports, memories, and nightmares. Exposure had come, and with it, the undeniable mark of ruin. The tragedy of Devil's Hollow became part of American folklore, not simply a tale of inbreeding, but of how faith warped into blindness, how conviction buried humanity, and how silence became a family's final language. And yet the story was not over. For those 12 boys taken from Devil's Hollow carried the bloodline forward, and what happened to them would determine whether the curse truly ended. The 12 boys taken from Devil's Hollow were scattered across state institutions. Doctors, guards, and attendants alike watched them with unease. Their blank stares unsettled every man who entered their wards, shadows lingering long after departure. At first, there was hope. Specialists believed these boys could be rehabilitated with patience, structure, and care. But soon the truth emerged. Whatever had been lost through generations could not easily be restored. The youngest among them showed faint signs of improvement. With repetition, they learned to wash themselves, to eat properly, to respond with gestures to simple commands. Yet their faces never softened, never flickered with emotion. Older boys were more difficult. They walked in slow unison through corridors, heads tilting together as if bound by invisible strings. Guards whispered they looked more like puppets than sons of men. Attempts at teaching them language failed. They repeated words like echoes without understanding, voices monotone, eyes vacant. No spark of comprehension shone through, no curiosity, no rebellion, only endless mechanical repetition. Doctors tried music, hoping rhythm might awaken feeling. The boys listened, unmoving. Some tapped feet in perfect synchronization, but none smiled, none sang, none betrayed joy. Music washed over them like meaningless sound. One physician described watching a boy stare at a ball for hours without touching it. Another stood motionless by a window, gazing into sky without blinking, as though searching for something unreachable. Nurses reported eerie behaviors when the boys gathered together. At times, they stood in perfect formation, aligned shoulder to shoulder without instruction, turning their heads simultaneously as if following commands only they could hear. The men who worked these wards admitted fear. Hardened orderlies confessed the boys felt unnatural, their silence heavier than shouting, their stillness more suffocating than violence. It was as if emptiness itself had form. Over time, despair replaced hope. Doctors realized the damage ran deeper than environment or upbringing. Generations of collapse had carved away the very structures that made men capable of expression, love, or individuality. Some of the youngest adapted slightly, learning to mimic normalcy. They greeted with words, even feigned smiles, but the hollowness remained. Behind gestures lay nothing. They were masks stretched across emptiness. The older boys deteriorated further. Many ceased eating, refusing sustenance without resistance, simply wasting away. Some lay in beds for days, unresponsive, neither struggling nor engaging, their bodies fading with quiet inevitability. Guards recalled walking into rooms to find boys standing in corners at night, staring blankly, unmoving for hours. Attempts to rouse them failed until dawn, when they resumed mechanical routines again. Reports circulated of eerie synchronization even in institutions. Some nights, boys tapped walls together in rhythm, or breathed in unison so perfectly it unsettled attendants who felt as if haunted by unseen choir. By the mid-1940s, several had died, not from wounds or disease, but from what physicians called loss of will. They stopped moving, stopped responding, stopped existing, as if life had ebbed away voluntarily. The deaths frightened staff. They described them as boys who simply decided to fade, eyes open until the final breath, expressions unchanged, as though death was merely another silent routine. Those who survived carried little improvement. Even the youngest never learned to express genuine joy or sorrow. They copied movements, recited words, but none of it came from within. It was emptiness rehearsed. A few men who worked closely with them kept journals. They confessed feeling dread, as if these children were not simply damaged, but something altogether different, men-shaped beings, lacking the inner spark of humanity. One guard admitted he prayed nightly after duty, asking for forgiveness for his fear. "They are boys," he wrote, "yet something in them feels not of us, not of mankind at all." The state continued care, but enthusiasm waned. Resources shifted, wars demanded attention, and the Holloway descendants slipped into obscurity, tucked into institutions, their tragedy too unsettling for public discussion. By the 1950s, most were gone. Those who remained existed quietly, walking corridors without purpose, sitting for hours in silence, living shadows. They neither caused trouble nor showed progress, occupying space without life. The last of them lingered into the early 1960s. Orderlies remembered him pacing the same hallway endlessly, eyes fixed forward, never speaking, never acknowledging anyone. He faded away in his sleep. With his death, the Holloway bloodline ended. Nearly 2 centuries of isolation, superstition, and inbreeding closed not with violence but with silence, extinguished by the very curse their patriarch mistook for purity. Yet their legacy remained. Photographs survived, hidden in attics and archives. Journals from doctors, guards, and sheriffs told of encounters too strange to dismiss. Whispers of Devil's Hollow spread, shaping folklore across Kentucky. Men in nearby towns swore the valley stayed cursed. Hunters avoided its trails, claiming the silence there was unnatural, heavier than any forest. Some said even birds refused to sing within its borders. The Holloway cabins eventually collapsed, consumed by vines and rot. Yet men who ventured near insisted they felt eyes watching, as though hollow stares still lingered in the shadows of broken timbers. For decades, the story lay buried, spoken only in whispers. But when the farmhouse was demolished in 1987, photographs emerged again, showing generations of lifeless faces staring forward like death masks. Those who saw them described sleepless nights, haunted not by deformity but by absence. The emptiness in those eyes defied explanation, reaching across centuries to chill men in the present. Historians debated whether the Holloways were victims of ignorance or architects of their ruin. Some argued Ezekiel cursed them with blind faith. Others insisted fate punished arrogance. None could explain the hollowness entirely. In time, the Holloway name became legend. Fathers told sons tales of the cursed valley, of blank-eyed men who once lived there, of silence so heavy it buried laughter forever. The photographs traveled into archives and private collections, studied by scholars who found themselves unsettled. Each image was more than history. It was evidence of something that eroded humanity until only shadows remained. The Holloway story became warning, not simply of inbreeding, but of how conviction unchecked can blind generations, how belief can twist men into husks, how silence can echo louder than any scream. Even today, Devil's Hollow remains uninhabited. Men avoid it instinctively, claiming the land feels wrong. Whether superstition or truth, the valley stands as grave to one of America's most disturbing bloodlines. The Holloways believed they were chosen. They believed stillness was purity, blankness was strength, silence was divine. But belief could not save them. It destroyed them, leaving behind only hollow faces in fading photographs. The tragedy endures because it speaks not only of one family, but of mankind's fragility. It shows how quickly humanity can dissolve when blinded by arrogance, when faith ignores nature, when silence replaces truth. In the end, the Holloways left no legacy of greatness, no monuments, no achievements. They left only warnings etched into sepia portraits, evidence that men can exist without ever truly living. Their final descendant died quietly, but his hollow gaze echoes still. It is a reminder that humanity is fragile, that choices matter, that no bloodline, no matter how proud, can defy nature forever. And so the story closes, not with triumph, but with silence. A silence as heavy as the valley that bore them, as eternal as the photographs that continue to stare without end.